Hello and welcome to CSIS, to those joining us in person and those joining us online. I'm Caitlin Welsh, Director of the CSIS Global Food Security Program. In The Lancet earlier this year, researchers published the results of a new study on the human health toll of antimicrobial resistance, or AMR. They found that AMR was the direct cause of about 1.3 million deaths in 2019. Earlier this year in Foreign Affairs, two luminaries stated that it's only because testing for AMR is poor that the numbers of cases and deaths caused by drug-resistant infections are not on the front pages of newspapers every day. Indeed, as many people die of AMR each year as die of HIV and malaria combined. AMR is not in the headlines every day, not only because testing is poor, but because more tangible crises dominate our news every day. And also because AMR crosses so many sectors: public health, water and sanitation, agriculture, aquaculture, and others. As resistance to microbials spreads and the toll of AMR expands, discussions like the ones we're having today only grow in urgency. Today we'll discuss AMR as a global security threat. Not only does AMR cause 1.3 million deaths per year, but it destabilizes livelihoods and diminishes food security. About 80% of the world's antibiotics are used to promote growth in the billions of poultry, pigs, and cattle consumed every year. The misuse of drugs promotes the proliferation of drug-resistant microbes, and it increases the risk that these superpathogens will jump to humans. To frame this important discussion, we are honored to have with us Rasmus Prehn, the Danish Minister for Food, Agriculture, and Fisheries. Denmark, of course, has a laudable record addressing AMR in the context of agriculture, which I hope the Minister will note today. We also have an expert panel featuring Rod Schoonover and Junxia Song. There is no person better equipped to explain the global security threats of AMR than Rod, given his decades of experience in the intelligence community and in academia. And we're pleased to have with us Junxia Song, who is one of the lead officers on AMR at the UN Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome. And Junxia is joining us from Rome this evening. I look forward to speaking with our panel about these topics. But first, it's my honor to introduce Denmark's Minister for Food, Agriculture, and Fisheries, Rasmus Prehn. Prior to this role, Minister Prehn also served as Denmark's Minister for International Development, among other positions. Since AMR disproportionately affects poor individuals and poor countries, and given the importance of the agriculture sector to AMR, Minister Prehn is uniquely positioned to explain the destabilizing effects of AMR. Minister, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, experts, speakers, participants, thank you to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, for hosting this very important meeting on antimicrobial resistance, which is one of the most important areas to discuss right now. I'm happy to be here today and to talk about this important topic. Antimicrobial resistance is a serious threat to health, society, and economic worldwide. The latest estimates suggest that antimicrobial resistance have directly attributed to 1.3 million deaths annually. In contrary to COVID-19, antimicrobial resistance can be described as a slow-motion tsunami. It becomes an increasingly bigger challenge for the security of our societies and economics worldwide. The COVID-19 pandemic might only be a taste of what antimicrobial resistance can do to the world without appropriate action. Global cooperation is key to winning the fight against antimicrobial resistance. Denmark advocates for One Health approach in the fight against antimicrobial resistance, and Denmark strongly supports the EU efforts in fighting antimicrobial resistance with One Health approach. Denmark is among the EU member states with the lowest consumption of antimicrobials in relation to the size of the animal production. In Denmark, we strive for healthy animals because healthy animals are the basis for low consumptions of antibiotics and thereby prevention of antimicrobial resistance. In the period from 2010 to 2021, Denmark achieved a reduction of 29.4% in total use of antimicrobials of pigs. This was achieved despite a steady increase in the number of pig produced. In the past 25 years, Denmark have launched several initiatives on this issue. This includes a total ban on the use of antimicrobial growth promoters as well as the successful Yellow Card initiative. This regulates the use of veterinary antimicrobials at pig farms with the highest relative consumption of antimicrobials. Antimicrobial resistance is a great threat to the security of the health of humans, animals, crops, and the environment. The highest burden is felt in low and middle income countries. Antimicrobial resistance is therefore a huge development problem. This clearly confirms the need for an organization like the International Center for Antimicrobial Resistance Solution, in short, ICARS. ICARS is an independent research organization which is supported by the World Bank and the Danish government and are working to secure actual change in low and middle income countries. ICARS filled the gap in intervention and implementation research. They bridge the gap between innovations and policies across the One Health spectrum. This includes veterinary, medicine, agriculture, and the environment. ICARS are experts in identifying the solutions that are needed and suits the local settings for the low and middle income countries. ICARS have projects in Latin America, Africa, and in Asia. They are an international organization and with the aim to be a global voice within the antimicrobial resistance agenda in low and middle income countries, with the overall goal of reducing antimicrobial resistance in these countries. The Danish government hopes to see other governments and foundations join ICARS and support the missions. We need global cooperation if we want to deal with the great challenge that antimicrobial resistance is posing to our health and society. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to an enlightening and engaging debate.
Thank you so much, Minister. Thank you. I look forward to building on your remarks in our discussion to follow. It's my pleasure right now to turn to Rod Schoonover, who is the head of the Ecological Security Program at the Council on Strategic Risks. Rod, I've known you for a long time from our careers at the State Department and after, and it's really my pleasure to host you on the stage at CSIS.
It's great to be here.
So I believe even at the State Department, going back 10 years, we probably discussed AMR. Yes. I know that you're still working on it. We spoke not long ago about the way that you understand AMR and the way that you explain it to others. So can you talk to us about how do you understand and order the overlapping risks that AMR presents?
Right, and thank you to CSIS for having me here on this really important topic. So I think it's really important the way that you phrase that question, because so often AMR is presented to the public as a public health issue, which it is assuredly so. But because of the impacts on food security and food safety, the use of antibiotics in livestock, in aquaculture, use of antifungals in agriculture, it's also a food security issue. Also, part of this is the economic dimension. Certainly, the numbers are quite staggering in terms of potential losses and as a global health burden. And I think the environmental dimension, which is oftentimes tagged on at the end, is almost certainly underappreciated and mischaracterized. And this is we should not be surprised that there is an environmental component, because antimicrobial resistance has been on Earth for billions of years. And so we should not be surprised to see it either intensify or emerge from the quote-unquote natural world. And this is a natural world that is under considerable stress, whether it might be nitrogen overabundance or metal pollution, both of which are known intensifying factors of antibiotic resistance.
Thank you.
So I'm not ordering them. So.
You're not, but thank you for emphasizing the risk to the environment, which I think you're right about that. And I think that's emphasized by something that I read recently in one of the most important articles that came out about this topic this year. This is a quote. It says, "The consequences of inaction are serious. With antibiotics rendered ineffective, societies would return to a world of greater death and deteriorating life expectancy, in which common medical procedures become more dangerous because of the high risk of untreatable infection."
Right.
But that's correct. But of course, that treats only the health
That's right.
consequences of AMR.
And even that is staggering, right? To even think about what that means when things that didn't used to be risky are now risky.
Yeah. So let's talk about this as a global security threat. So can you explain to us how you conceive of this as a global security threat? And can you provide maybe some more examples?
Sure. So I think it's unquestionably should be viewed as a security threat in terms of, if you just think about, say, 3 dimensions of security, beyond human security, which is, to me, obvious. There's, for example, the great strain that, so let me back up. One of the things we do in the national security world when things are fuzzy is to participate in scenario analysis. Imagine a future of high AMR, and then what does that world look like? And then if you look at 3 dimensions of security, one might be because of the high economic burden and the social disruption that would accompany it, you could expect that AMR would be a factor in political or social instability worldwide. Even in developed countries, if we learn nothing from COVID, is that even high GDP does not insulate countries from disruption. A second dimension of national security, or security writ large, if we see in this world drugs that are increasingly scarce that can be used, these drugs start to take on, become a critical resource. And that has all kinds of other security dimensions. You can imagine acrid geopolitics, or even worse, in controlling or harnessing or accessing these scarce resources. And a third dimension would be the direct impacts on the military. A military in which things that weren't risky before but are now, and injuries in the operating space or in the field that didn't seem to be major are now major. That actually puts a whole new strategic thinking in the military forces and how they view the battlefield. And that's just 3.
So to touch on something you just mentioned, you said in a world in which AMR is greater than it is today. So one thing that could get us to that point would be climate change. And I know that you've been thinking about the impact of climate change on AMR. Can you explain to us a little bit how that might affect it?
And this goes back about 3 or 4 years ago when I noticed that antimicrobial resistance, which is oftentimes talked about in the same kind of language as climate change, that there weren't a lot of studies looking at the overlap. And if you accept that if you accept that AMR has an environmental/ecological dimension, then you should expect climate change effects on AMR. But there's been precious little study on it. But if you just think about the mechanisms of AMR, and so there are 2 mechanisms, and not to get too scientific here, there is one that is called vertical gene transfer, where a mutation is passed to offspring cells. That mutation rate is temperature dependent because the bacterial growth rate and the bacterial replication rate and a number of other molecular processes are temperature dependent, and they're fueled by increasing temperature. The second mechanism by which AMR is transmitted is called horizontal gene transfer. That's from one bacteria to an unrelated bacteria. And there are several ways that horizontal gene transfer occurs. One of the things, I used to teach general chemistry. I'm a physicist, but I used to teach general chemistry. And at the root of this, AMR is a chemistry problem in addition to a biological problem. One of the first things you learn in chemistry is that most chemical reactions, of which horizontal gene transfer is a series of chemical reactions, accelerate. They intensify their rate at high temperature. And again, that's just one dimension of climate change, temperature. There are assuredly other impacts of climate change on AMR. We should not expect and presume that climate change will make AMR less dangerous, right? That is probably not a way to look at it. And so this is an area that deserves so much more study. But if you look in various IPCC reports that have come out in the last year and look for antimicrobial resistance inside of the climate change reports, I don't know if it's exactly 0, but it rounds to 0 mentions.
Wow.
So 2 issues of great importance, and we don't really understand the overlap.
So given all of the risks that you explained to global security, do you think that policymakers, maybe I'll condition this, policymakers in the United States are appropriately seized with this issue? And if not, I'm curious about, given your experience in the policymaking world and intelligence community, how do you think that we can increase policymakers' attention to this issue, given the immediacy of other concerns?
Well, the answer to your first question is, of course, no, that there is not enough attention paid to issues that are oftentimes perceived as being in the future. And we'll deal with this when we can, sometime in the future. One of the most powerful things to help decision makers and policymakers is help them better understand and visualize the future, right? The future that looks different than this future, than the present. And so things like scenario analysis, analytic simulations, right? Trying to put some time in the future to 2040 and then drop them into that world that almost assuredly looks quite different than the one that they are trained for and are living in. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. We'll return to a number of these things after I speak with our next guest. Thank you again, Rod. So right now I'm pleased to turn to Junxia Song, who is the AMR focal point and Senior Animal Health Officer with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. The FAO is based in Rome, and Junxia is joining us from Rome remotely in the evening. So thank you so much for making time at the end of your long day to speak with us. Junxia, thank you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Glad to be here to join this discussion.
Great.
This really important topic.
Good, thank you. The first question I'd like to ask you is, can you just explain for our audience, how does the UN organize its approach to AMR? And then what's the FAO's role in this governance?
Yes. International coordination on AMR is organized between the 4 organizations. We call it quadripartite: FAO, WHO, World Organization for Animal Health, ORE, and the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. Recently, a new MOU was signed among the 4 organizations to strengthen the One Health collaboration. So AMR is one of these priorities under this new MOU. And among these 4 organizations, there is a joint secretariat on AMR, which was established since 2019. You know, this quadripartite, we are moving from tripartite and to quadripartite. So, and then another important document is the AMR strategic framework. It was developed by the 4 organizations with a clear strategic objective and a longer-term vision. In parallel, there is a joint action plan was also developed, which will guide the collaboration and the coordination among the 4 organizations.
Okay.
So one thing I'd like to highlight that AMR Multi-Partner Trust Fund. This is a very, important instrument to support quadripartite collaborative actions.
Okay, thank you. So to speak a little bit about FAO's role, so I read something recently that governments and the private sector need to generate, update, and share information and analysis about resistance to antibiotics in much the same way that the IPCC tracks climate change. So interesting to know this analogy to climate change. So can you speak to us about the importance of generating, updating, and sharing information and how the FAO does that?
Yeah. It is about FAO's role, and this also related with the UN governance. FAO's role is support members to strengthen the capacities in food and agriculture sectors. And we published the FAO action plan from 2021 to 2025. And this new action plan, there is a pillar, surveillance and research. So surveillance would be a very important part under FAO's action plan. This regarding including the data sharing and the platform. I feel we are now establishing information and international information data system. The short name is INFAM. So at a global level, actually there is a agreement between FAO, WHO, and ORE. It's try to synergize on data collecting efforts and avoid any duplication. WHO will work on the data, including all the humans, related with humans, and ORE working on the data, AMU data in animals. And FAO working on AMR data in food and agriculture sectors, and also AMU data in crops. So in this way, we are now compared with WHO and ORE, FAO is a little bit behind because we are just starting at the IT development of this platform. And we are hoping we will have launched this data platform by the end of this year.
Okay, good, thank you. Thank you very much. Can you repeat the name of the platform for our audience?
INFAM it's like INFAM, but it's just an acronym.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Good, thank you. We look forward to learning more about this. So again, given that the focus of this event is on the destabilizing effects of AMR, can you give us some examples of the ways that AMR disrupts livelihoods of those engaged in agriculture?
Yes, AMR has both direct and indirect impact on livelihood. This disrupts directly from the resistance microbes. So the most common thing is that increased the cost of treating some disease that were normally sensitive to some specific antimicrobials, but due to resistance and more time and different antimicrobials, I need to achieve the same result. And this will have an immediate economic impact on the health systems, and also knockdown effect across the whole health system. So in agri-food system, it may end up in a big part of the production being lost. And the spread of the resistance microbials is more difficult to contain. it may further ending up more serious production losses. So sometimes the livestock animals or products has to be destroyed due to resistance pathogens or some serious antimicrobial residues. For example, I think in Europe, EU, some countries, cows infected with penicillin-resistant staphylococcus should be culled instead of treated according to the relevant policies. And also antimicrobial residues in meat, milk, egg, or fish is a serious public health threat. So, for example, in milk, antimicrobial residue milk was first detected even in last century in 60s. So that's a huge meat, eggs, destroyed because of the serious antimicrobial strategies.
Okay, you said that was milk, that example that you gave?
Yeah, I don't have the concrete data here, but I know in many countries, residues detect is a routine work. So once they detect any residues and above the bar, so it has to be destroyed. Okay. Maybe another example I can give is antimicrobials also has to be used in crops production. Yes. So, for example, the antimicrobials triazole, that will be as common used in plant production, but it contributed a lot to antifungal resistance for human disease called aspergillosis.
Okay, thank you. I think that we're very used to understanding the use of antimicrobials in animal rearing, but not so much in actual crop production. So thanks for providing that example. Just want to ask, are there any other examples you can give of ways that AMR threatens food safety?
Yeah, I just mentioned AMR threatens food safety, food security in many different ways. For example, AMR pose risk and reduce productivity due to clinical illness and the long period and the low productivity, and due to prolonged period of treatment. So, and also sometimes treatment failure. So this will increase food security, also price increases. Yeah. AMR microorganisms may contaminate food products and reduce the food quality and reducing the product shelf life. And this may result in food losses and also food insecurity. To farmers that depend on animal production and the products for a subsistence, AMR may result in reduced the earnings due to their reduced productivity losses, and also this results in food insufficiency and also in security for their families. So another thing is that potential food safety issue may arise when AMR microorganisms are present and then transmitted to humans from food. From food. Yeah, we just mentioned if detect food contained AMR microorganisms, and the animals, the products will be destroyed. Yeah. That's another way of food waste and lost.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Junxia. Thank you for giving us that overview of AMR from your lens, from where you sit at the FAO. I'd like to turn now to some discussion about these issues. Rod, first I'd like to ask you, is there anything that you would like to add to what we said earlier based on Junxia's remarks?
I think the food safety dimension is crucially important. I think the concept, the idea of antibiotic and antimicrobial resistance genes going upstream through agriculture, crops into human consumers, I think is a very interesting thing to consider. Yeah. So.
Thank you. So we have some good questions from the audience. I have one for Rod, then I'll turn to Junxia for another question. But one question for you, Rod, is you mentioned using scenarios to help policymakers visualize future threats. Do you have other suggestions for how to increase the sense of urgency around AMR and spur action among policymakers?
I do. One of the things I think is important, I've spent a lot of time working on climate change issues where the risks are almost always underscoped. It's the same issue that I see with antimicrobial resistance. Oftentimes, if it's seen in just one pillar, oh, this is a public health problem, it doesn't tend to get the kind of attention that it deserves. And so one thing that we know is things like climate change affect practically everything. And so it's the same, that's why I go out of my way when I talk about AMR. I talk about the economic piece, I talk about the ecological piece, and the security piece. And all of those voices inside of any government probably should be at the table discussing AMR, and it should not just be in the Ministry of Health or whatever analog, right? And so having more voices articulating the problem and make sure we scope the problem correctly. Because if you don't scope the problem correctly, the policies that you employ are almost ineffective, ineffective, or at least at best partially effective.
Do you think that having experienced and still experiencing the COVID pandemic makes it easier for policymakers to visualize these multidimensional threats? So it's not just one, it's not just a health issue, it's economics, it's politics, it's military, et cetera.
Yes and no, right? Yes, we're living through the most acute disruption in the last 100 years from a microbial source, right? And so we are reminded once again, as many societies worldwide, what can come out of the microbiosphere and turn everything upside down, right? The acute social disruption, the political overtones. But then, at the same time, there are studies that COVID-19 has turned attention away from AMR, unfortunately. So in a world where people see resources as finite, any resources over here will not be deployed over here.
Yeah, unfortunately. I have a question for Junxia, and then I'll turn back to you for another question, Rod. Thank you. Junxia, so turning to the specifics, can you give us some examples of what those engaged in agriculture can do to support efforts to combat AMR? What does it look like on the ground let's say in a lower middle income country when a farmer makes efforts to combat AMR? What are some specific actions?
Yeah, I think at the farm level, actually, this is a really very good question. At the farm level, we really can see something happened to help combating AMR. Just, I think in the very beginning, you gave a very good number. It's like 80% of antimicrobials was being used for animals. So who use this antimicrobials? They are the farmers. So at farm level, we can see, for example, behavior change and good biosecurity, and also antimicrobials and good vaccination programs. And so those are directly related with farm level. So it really can help the farmers to reduce the need in crops, in livestock, in agri-food systems. So, and now also actually in FAO, we are now going to start discussion, launch this campaign to reduce the need in agri-food system. So we are now thinking reduce the use because antimicrobials use sometimes is critical important to maintain the productivity and the healthy of animals and crops. But we are talking to reduce the need.
Okay, thank you. And you gave one specific example, which is using vaccines in animals to reduce the incidence of infections in the first place. Now, what can policymakers do? Actually, what can the FAO do to support actions like that by farmers?
Yeah, first, I think from through antimicrobials, through vaccination program to reduce antimicrobial use, first we can start to have a look at the disease situation. What are the diseases really drive the use of antimicrobials at the farm level? So building on this, we can see how many vaccinations already available. and how the policymaker to invest, to encourage the innovation to have new vaccines to be alternatives for antimicrobials. So in this, another way, we can also to organize trainings for farmers to advocates advise them how better utilize vaccination and to try to reduce the use of antimicrobials.
Okay, thank you. So another question for you, Junxia. So of course the FAO serves all member states of the United Nations. Can you explain a little bit how AMR risks differ in low and middle income countries compared to high income countries like Denmark and like the United States? How do the risks look different in different types of countries?
Yeah, I think FAO, our focus is really LMIC countries compared with these two high income and low income. So for example, in low income, their priority is they need food security first, and then they need the nutrition. So those are really different levels among the two different high income countries and the low income countries. So now at FAO, we try to link these two different groups with hand-in-hand initiative. For example, we just mentioned MPTF funds. Those are funds mostly come from the high-income countries like Netherlands, UK, and Sweden. So they put efforts in the low and immediate-income countries to strengthen their capacities, to strengthen surveillance, and especially support their data generation to have evidence to better advocate the stakeholders how to better strengthen the AMR risks in low and medium countries.
Okay, thank you. Minister Prehn discussed Denmark's great successes eliminating the use of antimicrobials in their animal husbandry, and this is a rather controversial topic. Can you tell us? I know that again this is very controversial. What the FAO's position is with regard to the use of antimicrobials in livestock rearing, particularly for growth promotion?
Yeah, for growth promotion, FAO we will support the members to phase out growth promoter. That's definitely, but maybe in different countries has the different efforts, different stages. But our efforts will really support to reduce, to phase out. We suggest we will support the members to utilize the international guidelines. For example, Codex guideline, ORE guideline, and also maybe IPPC guidelines. WHO also has similar guidelines to try to reduce the phase out growth promoter. Okay. So because we promote responsible use antimicrobials in agri-food system, and there are different multi-purpose of antimicrobials being used in livestock animals. For example, growth promotion, preventive use, control use, treatment. If we are talking about responsible use, we are not including growth promotion.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for that explanation. I'd like to talk about, I guess, looking to the future. So, 3 years ago, it was a theoretical question about what would happen if a novel coronavirus would appear, and that would be a future scenario that we would think that was only theoretical, and of course that's not the case. If we were to look now to the future in terms of what increased AMR, what effects it would have around the world, which regions or countries do you think would be most vulnerable to an outbreak of AMR resistance among livestock populations or otherwise? But do you think that there are particular regions or even countries that would be most vulnerable?
It's a hard question for me because I see AMR as a global problem that very quickly crosses boundaries from its point of origin. And in fact, we've seen, for example, some fungal species that developed antifungal resistance in one corner of the world very quickly moved to pretty much all over the world. And so, that may be a question for the other panelists, but I see this not any line of thinking that makes us think that this is exclusively an issue of the developing world, I think is a dangerous way to think about it, that the so-called developed world is somehow more immune to AMR. I think there's the clinical setting, and then there's the livestock aquaculture setting.
Yeah.
I think they both have vulnerabilities.
Okay. Junxia, do you have an answer to this question about regions or specific countries that you think might be most at risk?
Yeah, I agree. This is a not easy question, but it may also related with who are the really big consumers of antimicrobials. And it is also related with the big population of livestock. So in terms of the recent some data, so the livestock population increased like 2% annually. So we're just seeing at the livestock, most of antimicrobials will be used in food animals, livestock, fisheries. So we can looking at who are the countries, the specific regions has the big population, the high density of livestock, and the big consumption of antimicrobials. That might be the high risk area.
Okay, thank you. So I have one or two more questions here, and then when we're finished with questions, then I'll turn to Rod and Junxia for any final remarks you'd like to make. But before I ask any more questions that we've gotten online, would anyone in the audience like to ask questions? We do have microphones set up if that's the case. So I want to remind you that's the case. Thank you. Okay, good, thanks. Just wanted to make sure you're aware that that's an option. So I think that the last question that we've received online is about, I already know this answer is going to be difficult to answer this question, but how should policymakers prioritize AMR in relation to other global security threats? You know, I mentioned at the beginning that there are a lot of reasons that this is not in the headlines every day, but there are other ongoing threats such as the conflict in Ukraine, COVID-19, et cetera. How do we prioritize these threats that are conceived of as future threats when we have other things, right before us?
Right. I mean, it's the reason we're in the ecological predicament that we currently find ourselves in, not just with climate change and not just with biodiversity loss, but also with AMR. We invented systems thinking 40 years ago, roughly, so that we could look at problems and systems holistically without having to sacrifice the arm to save the thumb, right? Anything that moves us away from systems thinking, which means when you answer a question, which gets the highest priority, any list that has AMR down the list is a dangerous one. This is one of the most pressing issues currently facing the future. And so it can't be an either-or type of solution. It is a very dangerous, dangerous future, and it's also one that requires an international response, a complex, adaptive response, and so. Yeah. Yeah. You knew I was going to say something like that.
I did. Thank you. Yeah, we can come back to that. And I'm glad that we started this event with remarks from the minister talking about ICARs.
Right.
And, yeah.
My PhD is in complex systems physics, so I just resist the idea of pulling things apart. So.
Yeah. How do you create hierarchies of threats when? Yeah. Right. How did you do that in the intelligence community?
It's hard, right? The intelligence community, the national security community of the United States, which is probably true for all countries, is very siloed. And there's a unit that looks at this kind of national security and this unit that looks at this kind, and they don't typically talk to each other, even when the issues overlap. And it just for whatever reason, this is how organizations evolve to resist collaboration. And you almost have to have an enabling force to get these groups to talk to each other.
Yeah.
But it's easier said on the stage than to do it.
Yeah, yeah. We'll come back to you for some final remarks. Speaking of siloing and resisting silos, so Junxia, you mentioned that there are many parts of the UN that are addressing this from different angles. You are, of course, the focal point at the FAO. Would you like to make any final comments for our audience?
Yeah, I think I just want to highlight that One Health approach is really important to address AMR and also linked with other health threats. So now under UN, we are working on a joint One Health action plan. This includes AMR, emerging disease, endemic disease, climate, biodiversity, and also food safety. So in this way, we can address AMR in a holistic way. And so hopefully we can join efforts with more stakeholders to really can combat AMR. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Thank you so much, Junxia. Rod, any final comments?
Just a couple. The other panelists brought up One Health. I think that is as the National Academy study from last year, which I encourage everyone to look at, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine did a full report on antimicrobial resistance. This is one of the most authoritative studies in the United States on the topic. And just as they remarked, this is a complex adaptive problem that requires a complex adaptive solution. And One Health is that kind of solution. And it's important to remember that One Health looks at human health and animal health, but also looks at the ecological dimension as well, which in my opinion, should be dialed up in how we articulate AMR and how we understand it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for mentioning that report, the National Academy of Science report, full report on antimicrobial resistance, which we will tweet from my program's account. So as we conclude, I would like to give special thanks to Minister Prehn for joining us today and for your opening remarks. And very special thanks to our panelists, to Rod Schoonover for joining in person, for Junxia Song joining us from Rome late in the evening. Thank you both so much for this very, very interesting and very, very important conversation. I'd like to thank the Royal Danish Embassy in Washington for partnering with us in today's event. Thanks to the audience for joining us in person and online. And thank you again, and please follow us on Twitter at CSIS Food.